So tonight, Paul has taken on one of my favorite books, and the author of whom is sitting here this evening. So,
No pressure.
you will have to be very patient and just, go with the flow. And but anyway, uh, this is how baseball happened. Outrageous lies exposed, the true story revealed. And if you know Tom Gilbert, he has this rather unique uh, way of going about his research and looking deeper and deeper and deeper into things that are truly remarkable. And much of that begins to unfold in this book. And it is probably the very right title, How Baseball Happened. So without further ado, and Bob may have a few ground rules here.
No,
Uh,
we're good. It's an informal sort of session. Everybody is welcome to participate.
okay,
Paul will
just
moderate as
give,
we go forward.
give Paul some kind of a signal or just speak out,
It's
and
all good.
we'll try to get it
Most
all
of
done.
us are, from New York or Philadelphia or somewhere, where baseball happens. So I'm sure in Boston, I'm sure we can, talk over each other. So anyway, so I actually wanted to do the last month's book for the
Hello
record.
from St. Louis.
What's that? Oh, I actually wanted to do the last month's book for the record. And I sent it in and then realized Matt had claimed that book. And then Peter sent me an email that basically came back and said, hey, pick something else. And without really thinking, I was like, I'll do How Baseball Happened, Tom's book. I'm going to reread it and do it. And it's a good idea. And then I hit send and I literally thought to myself, what was I thinking? And then I came into this meeting and I saw Tom sitting here and I cracked open my beer and I was like, what am I really thinking? Because I don't know if I can hold a candle to Tom. Anyway, we've all read the book. We've all gone ahead and we've heard Tom speak multiple times at SABR. One of the coolest things I have to admit to you, Tom, as I was reading this book, I was hearing your voice narrating it in my head, especially the chapter about Creighton, because I saw your presentation last year about Creighton, and I was like, it's like a little audio book in my head with Tom. So anyway, I'm sorry. I just got a few things, and then I'm gonna really volunteer an audience participation because, as I said in the beginning, I took a page of notes and then I left chapter 1. So I'm not sure how this is gonna go. We're gonna wing it and see what happens.
Sure.
The goal of this book is how did baseball happen? The stories and anecdotes of the research is telling a tale of many interwoven tales, one over another that create not only the book but baseball itself. Spalding says, and Tom echoes, baseball is completely American. However, this is colored by personal business, interests, or jingoisms. Whatever definition you choose, no one invented other cultural phenomenon like rock and roll. And I love that statement as I read through it again, Tom. I said baseball by definition is an American culture. Its growth and happening and stacking on itself is just that. Despite the rules and the changes and everything, even though my wife will argue with me about this point to her dying day about the DH, baseball is and still will be baseball. So I kind of wanted to get a little thoughts on people's, just to kick it around the room a little bit. And, the first thoughts of the book, the Americanism of the book, baseball is American, and go from there.
Well, Paul, I particularly like the whole part, and Tom too, about the whole amateur era, because this has been touched upon before. But I always just love reading about that. I love reading about how the teams were. Yeah, you mentioned the occupation, Tom. You mentioned the occupations. Shipbuilders. Let's see, what do I have on my notes here? Uh, uh, the patriarchs, the oak trees, shipbuildings. I just and what these players were while they weren't playing baseball. I think that was I just love reading about that. I don't see it enough in baseball books That was my favorite part. And also, you mentioned Jim Creighton, Paul. That part just blew me away because, the amount of research that went into that whole section, and what a fascinating guy, too. No.
Well, one of the things that's always struck me about baseball research, especially early, how it happened was parallels to golf research, which I'm sort of an amateur golf historian too, that trying to establish who invented golf. And of course, nobody did. It just evolved like baseball did. There's also the argument that while Scotland is credited with being the inventor of golf, there's been claims from the Low Countries, from Netherlands, from Scandinavia, actually, very much parallel to how some English sources claim that that baseball was just an Americanization of some British ball games.
Mhm.
I
And
threw
also,
real quick, Jack. I would say I threw this kind of to your point, Bruce. I threw this in my notes. I said, let's see here. The heart and soul of men of the area these are the EUBs. Heart and soul men of the era, the butchers and shipwrights and millers and lawyers
right.
and doctors
Uh-huh.
that formed the primordial soup, is the word I used, of the men that were the EUB and played and spread the game, the New York game. So go ahead, Jack.
Uh, no, I lost my thought, but it'll come back to me, Paul. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Are we just free farming in here or raising?
Yeah.
This is Stu.
Yep.
Both from the book, but also when you had that virtual conference in Brooklyn a few years ago, and I watched the whole thing, Tom's tour, Tom's presentation, not Roy, Campanella guy from Cornell. And it hit me that, yeah, Brooklyn is such a good case can be made for Brooklyn as the birthplace of baseball. And that's what I think has stuck with me more from the book and from that virtual conference that you had a few years ago.
First fans, first ballpark, first pitching, first tickets, right? I mean, Brooklyn fans bought the first tickets. It's hard. I mean, I think picking one place is difficult, but if you had to pick one, it's easy choice.
Also, the parts about just dissecting, Alexander Cartwright and Doubleday and talking about them both individually as people, and all the whole personal touch throughout the book. I liked hearing that in those early days.
One of the things kind of on that, Jack, and I told you this, Tom, one of the first times I ever met you, is I absolutely, one of the favorite things for me about the book is, and I think you called it the bullshit chapter, or the bullshit
Yeah.
section,
Uh-huh.
where you basically, for example, you have like here where we're talking about all this, and all of a sudden Chowder's Democratic. And we have these little kind of cool little side anecdotes that are almost like side miniature stories. So, by the way, I still have not had my buddy make chowder. It's on my to-do list.
Oh yeah, we
So-
should do it as a thread and
Yeah,
save something for catering.
That's a great idea.
Tom, if
Need to
you
have a
make
little-
chowder from that recipe?
I don't know. It's a little frightening because they cook it for a really, really long time. But I mean, they must have known what they were doing.
Just a bit. So, I think that one of the things, just to kind of go back to the American sense, is that I think it's in our American way that we think, and this is something you really dissolve the myth, which I think is amazing. You have the baseball happened, and as you read through the book, the myth of the creation myth itself. I think as Americans, we have to have, or we have to have those days. July 4th, 1776 has to happen in our mind for the American colonies to become independent, or does it? And I think that's something that's truly American. You mentioned the word jingoism, which is not a lot of people use that anymore. It's a great word. It's basically the manifest destiny full of ourselves as Americans. We have to have the creation myth. And I think that's a phenomenal thing. The whole book centers around this spelling of this one day, this one moment in time of this creation myth. So I don't know if anybody wants to kind of run with that or talk a little further on that one.
Well, a quick point, Paul. I saw in the book, and I did not know this, that Spalding himself did not even believe the creation myth.
Yep.
And Even though, of course, he founded the whole committee and everything.
I mean, the irony to me is if you read the, I think it's the 1908 Spalding Guide where they announce the findings of the Mills Commission, but then, and those are obviously ridiculous, right? But then there's a long essay by Chadwick defending his position and a long essay by Spalding. And the weird part is that Spalding, who had just paid for this ridiculous lie about Doubleday, is completely reasonable in his arguments, and they're very persuasive, and he has a much better case than Chadwick that baseball is American. And I think the Mills Commission was basically a semi-serious kind of publicity stunt. But the Spalding was, and Chadwick, I mean, I don't know how serious Chadwick was, but Spalding was dead serious that he thought it was invented in America. And I don't think he cared who did it when. But to him, it was important that it be American. He believed it was American, and I agree with him. His arguments are actually, if you just forget the Doubleday thing and read his arguments, they're very good. And of course, the other thing is that if he was wrong, it almost doesn't matter, because what made baseball more attractive than cricket was the perception that it was American. So even a wrong perception, it makes the same point that Americans wouldn't play, for reasons that are specific to that place and time, and those people wouldn't play a British sport.
Yeah.
I mean, they played it, but they wouldn't select it as their national sport.
Yeah.
So I want to open up a can of worms. This is a little bit it's challenging to wrap my mind around, and I want to talk. We talked about the amateur era as a whole. So my question is, and I wanted to ask you this, and Tom, as you're here. So we obviously know that, the amateur era was, they were amateurs. They were not professionals. They had other jobs. They had other abilities. It was a founded league. The National Association of Baseball Players was founded, but they were still amateur status. But my question, I guess, to you and to the rest of the crowd is that, so we looked at Creighton, and we understand Creighton and some of his other teammates were compensated. They were compensated by good jobs. They were compensated by a house. They were compensated by any of these other matters. We know that these other teams became professional in the 1869 season, but I guess I would say, that onset of how these players were compensated challenge the notion of professionalism, or would you push the time clock back, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, it's really a tricky thing where the line is when you cross it and you've violated the amateur ethic, because we can read the rules, but the rules were not enforced literally and strictly and ever.
That's right.
Right. So
yeah,
the real question is,
you had to be in the National Association.
I'm saying that the rule about that you can't a player cannot be compensated. That's open to interpretation, and it was interpreted differently at different times during the amateur era, right? And when Thomas Fitzgerald, breaks with the Athletics, and he says they're totally going over the line by paying players salaries. But he himself was involved in recruiting Reach, who got a house and a business. And obviously Tom Fitzgerald didn't think there was anything wrong with that. Right? And no one, in fact, said, what about what you gave Al Reach? So, I mean, I've always felt like it's a really sticky question that you have to think long and hard about before you make a judgment that something was a violation of the amateur ethic. Because you remember Chadwick, there's a famous opinion piece that he wrote where he said, what he was really saying was, professionalism isn't about compensation or pay as such. It's about the idea that players become mercenaries. That's the thing that offended him. And he thought that was over the line. So in other words, Reach going to Philadelphia and staying there, no problem. In fact, he said, this is mutual aid by fellow club members, which you could argue Creighton and Flanley getting help or Leggett getting help is the same thing. But I just think the bottom line is, I think it's not an easy distinction to draw from our perspective. Because it's not like they ignored it, and it's not like it's obvious what it meant. So it's a tricky question. It's a gray line.
Well,
I guess the question please go ahead.
One of the points
that you make in your book, Tom, is that loyalty was a valued commodity. The idea that this was I don't know, a band of brothers,
Mhm.
the team, and that the problem was you are being disloyal to your comrades by moving to another team.
Right.
And whether or not the comrades helped each other, perhaps by, some sort of what we would call compensation, was secondary.
I think that's true.
I have a question. Did all the getting houses and jobs, did that go into the 1870s and all? Because I've done so much work on the Chicago White Stockings. I don't remember ever seeing anything about any of the players being compensated in any way. I mean, but my work has been from the like 1871 on.
Well, they were getting paid salaries at that point.
Well, yeah, but did any of them get anything under the table? I'm thinking of though.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
But
I remember
define
It's
on.
inevitable just from economics that
Yeah,
they would have been
economics.
getting
Yeah,
something
I
under
would
the
think
table
so.
or
Mhm.
side jobs in the off season.
When
You
I was
know,
a kid,
a
Roger
make work
Maris.
job as a saloon bouncer or something.
Yeah.
I
Anyone
mean,
remember
so
Roger Maris when he wanted to retire? I think it was, and the Cardinals gave him the beer distributorship for Northern Florida.
yeah.
oh
Well, I
yeah.
mean, side jobs as a whole, I mean, what they continued pretty much into the 50s, did they not? I know Yogi had a side job, and obviously they went into more sponsorships, but I think, you talked about these as went then on there, not everybody had the Babe Ruth salary. There was the 26th player on the roster that had to, pedal meat or something. So,
Wouldn't be
but
surprised if teams help guys find those jobs. But I mean, professional baseball is a different animal.
I guess the question, just to follow up on that, Tom, is, and I guess this is almost like, it looks like the National Association of Baseball Players almost turned a blind eye to this in a lot of ways, because you made a really interesting point when we're talking about Creighton. And you talked about the fact that his family was the only one of two that didn't have any servants in that house. And you talked about that his father, as a matter of fact, to have this customs house job, his precursor was, he was I forget the word you used, something along the lines of a I can't remember, something about the way
Yeah,
he was a
he managed
bartender.
the quarter and cider vault.
Yeah, but you use a specific word, it cracked me up. But I'm curious, why did the I almost said NAACP, wrong one, National Association of Baseball Players, in a way, turn a blind eye in this? They had to have known about this. It wasn't,
Well, I mean, I think the simple answer, most likely one, is that they didn't think it was over the line. And
that's crazy.
one thing in the book, I make a point about this, but the Excelsiors, they fudge some details about their relationship with Creighton, but none of them have to do with compensation.
Mhm.
Like the main untruth that they were telling was that he grew up in the same neighborhood as the other players. The standard biography says that he came to Brooklyn as a child. He was recruited to Brooklyn as a 16 or 17-year-old.
Mm.
So when you think about it, the stuff they're being dishonest or spinning is the stuff that's significant to them. So they didn't have a cover story for, they needed a house. George Flanley, they helped him because his father died and there was a big family. There was no cover story for how they helped Creighton. There was a cover story for the fact they recruited him when he was a teenager.
But it's interesting to me, just kind of in a quick segue into that, you talked about him being recruited as a 16 or 17-year-old. But then on the flip side of that, so they had a very hard line about what was, I believe you had to be 21 to play on the non-junior circuit. But you look at something like, they had that hard line, so they were very strict about that. But you have, the Stockings, the Red Stockings, most of them were under the age of 25. So why such a hard line on some of these 17, 18, 19-year-olds? That's been a thorn in my side when looking at some of the feeder clubs up to the Buffalo Niagaras.
I mean, did they draw a hard line in Buffalo about age? Because there were some pretty young players. There were definitely players under 18 who played for the Dolphins.
Well, James Sidway was actually part of the Frontier Baseball Club. and they played the Niagara, but they were considered a junior circuit. So I think our conversation offline was about there was a hard line, and some of the junior clubs took it outside and said, "Fine, we'll do our own thing." But I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. I don't really have an easy answer to that one. Didn't Cummings join the Excelsiors well before he was 18?
And been very successful.
I don't know. Do you guys know offhand?
But there's no written rule about that, right? It was more of a custom.
Bruce, do you know offhand?
I think I've seen a National Association rule saying you had to be 21. Now, at least for the 1858. Now, whether that was dropped afterwards, I can only speak to 1858.
Interesting.
Now, again, an age thing would be a lot easier, I think, to enforce than a compensation thing. Compensation can be budget can be under the table, but your age is generally something that's a pretty hard fact.
Wasn't Cal McVeigh a teenager when he was on the 69 Reds?
I'm not sure. I think you said in your book it was the youngest was 22, maybe.
I think McVeigh was 19, unless I remember it wrong.
Are they always sure about birth dates? Because Perry Worden's birth date is anywhere from 1861 to 1864. Even earlier, it seemed like it could.
Oh, in those days, they didn't have birth certificates. If you were baptized at a church, there'd be a church record if you wanted to find it.
Right.
But I've seen 5-10 year differences in the censuses of very famous people. Heck, we don't even know where Phil Sheridan was born. He was the general in chief of the Army and a Civil War hero. So if that's unclear, you can imagine some son of a Brooklyn dock worker. There'd be even less documentation as to the birth.
So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm jumping around in the book, and I think that's just sort of a good general conversation to have as far as especially with a book like this. So I wanted to look at the second to last chapter where we talked to Tom. You talked about the growth of baseball after the Civil War and how it exploded. And it was interesting to me because I read the book Baseball in Blue and Gray, but I think you really did a succinct job of actually kind of talking about it, about how many, the growth of the Army itself. It went from 200,000 to 20 million, I think is my numbers right. But I think that's a fascinating thing. You talk about that, you talk about the railroads, you talk about this, but then looping back to Cincinnati. So I actually had a question that was kind of bringing it up here, and for the life of me, I can't find my note here. It's taken a moment, but to summarize, you talked about Cincinnati, and you talked about, I think this is a great example of how baseball happened. You talked about the fact that they had a cricket field, they had a stadium, 4,000 people. They had Henry Wright. They had Porkopolis. They were the epicenter of the West. They had the way that they could move east or west on the rail yards. They had the financial back of this giant pork monopoly. So you can understand in some ways why professionalism started in Cincinnati. But I guess my question would be, and I'm going to throw this out to the group, but we know there were you mentioned there were 4 or 5 other teams out there that actually went ahead and specifically turned professional. Why didn't they have the same growth and the same kind of tours they did, but a bigger, more publicized tour than Cincinnati? If that makes sense.
That's a good question. I mean, because the Cincinnati, they weren't the first professional team. They were in a group of that all decided to go into the professional category in '69.
Yep.
But I think, being on the frontier and being kind of on the outside looking in, when the Washington Nationals come in '67 and destroyed them, there was a feeling of we want to catch up. Cincinnati was the biggest city that wasn't on a coast, I believe, in the 1860s. And, it's part of the spirit of the Midwest and the West to want to catch up with the East. And maybe they got tired of having to hire second baseman from Brooklyn. They wanted to, they wanted to, actually be as good as these Eastern powerhouses. Maybe the unions of Morrisania didn't have the same motivations. And the other thing is that it's definitely a plan that Harry Wright is part of, and Joyce, the other people that ran the team. They have an agenda besides just winning. It's also selling the game to the country. I thought the first time I actually looked at the how the '69 Red Stockings came to be, the first thing that kind of jumps out at you is how young they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a definite plan by Harry Wright to build a team that has the stamina to not only win, but to go 10,000 miles on railroad tracks and crisscross the country and play several times a week. He was a stickler for training, but it's basically a bunch of 23-year-olds. Brainerd was 27, Harry Wright was all in his 30s. Everyone else is very, very young. And I think that represents an intelligent plan by Harry Wright to put together a team that can go from New Orleans to Chicago to Sacramento to the East Coast, crisscrossing the nation for more than a year.
But I think, in contrary to that, what stuck out to me is I found the passage in the book here. Basically, they were not alone. The New York Mutuals, the Brooklyn Athletics, the Philadelphia Athletics, the Washington Nationals, and the Troy Haymakers all turned professional at that same time. So my question is, if you're talking about those cities, you talked about it earlier in the book about the size of New York, which is really what actually led to the growth of these teams and the growth of baseball, and the fact that that's where it started. The fact that Brooklyn was actually bigger than Philadelphia. So, but I guess my question is, why wasn't there any backing in those powerhouse cities? Why you talked about Tammany Hall? Wouldn't there be an interest for Tammany Hall to get involved for that growth, for the monetary side of it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's probably complicated. The Tammany Hall was involved with the Mutuals, and the Atlantics were backed by the Brooklyn Democratic machine. But I always felt like there was in New York and Brooklyn, there at a certain point there's a little bit of a complacency because they dominated baseball so much, and they didn't feel like they had a lot to prove. Cincinnati in 1868 has a lot to prove, as does Chicago and Detroit and St. Louis and a lot of other places.
Yeah. You're nodding your head, Bruce. Anything you want to add to that, or just nodding your head? I
was saying in 1860, I put this in the chat, in 1860, Cincinnati was the largest city by a very small margin in the interior over St. Louis. But by 1870, Chicago and St. Louis had far surpassed it. So when we're talking about 1868 or 69, Cincinnati was not the largest city in the interior anymore. It would have been St. Louis or Chicago.
Yeah. And that was part of the railroads and the growth of that, and the post-Civil War expansion and explosion. So, Ken, I see you put something in the chat. Do you want to read it out, or would you like me to speak for you?
You can go ahead. I think it sort of speaks for itself.
Yeah. So Ken mentions here the brief mention of politician journalist Matt Welsh. It's fascinating. In the recent PBS series American Revolution, Ken Burns drove home the point the North and South put off the settling of slavery to have the Union. Did baseball essentially have the same understanding in the post-Reconstruction era to keep peace? The journalists that came along after Walsh often had the same basic attitude. So I'm going to default to the crowd on that one as far as to start out, if you guys would like.
I think the answer is yes. I think the Civil War was badly timed from baseball's point of view. They're determined to sell the game to the whole country, and they were making progress in the South. And then suddenly it becomes race becomes so polarizing that it threatens the project. And I think that's what the Pythian thing is really about.
Mm-hmm.
67.
I think there's also folks that would challenge that. I loved your chapter on Frank Grant about how Chapman basically just kept putting him in the lineup. put him in, put him in, put him in. Doesn't matter. So he definitely, I think, challenged that, that mantra, so to speak, which led to, the banning of black players.
Well, there's a conflict. Once it's professional, it's a whole different issue, right? I mean, I remember after I wrote the How Baseball Happened book, and I was doing all these interviews because it was COVID. I was doing everything remotely, and I think I'd done 45 or 50 interviews without anyone bringing race up, and I was waiting for someone to ask me why baseball clubs full of abolitionists and supporters of Lincoln were all white. But it's a totally different question in an amateur time when it's a social club. I think the short answer to that question is that nobody on like the Eagles or Gotham's knew any black people or the unions because they were living so separately. Mm-hmm. But once money's on the line, Jack Chapman didn't care what color Frank Grant was. He knew he was a good hitter and could play second base and hit home runs. It's a much more complicated issue, and it's actually really interesting how a lot of our stereotypes about parts of the country being racist are really called into question by how people reacted to the integration that happened in the 1870s and 80s. Toronto apparently had a horrible racial atmosphere and was particularly ugly. The fans' behavior there was particularly ugly when a black player would come in the International League.
Oh, absolutely.
And, places that we might think the opposite of and weren't. And, there's no real pattern to it, a geographical or cultural pattern. I think there's lots of it. The whole thing is in flux and there's lots of tension about it and lots of polarizing opinions about it. And it's the whole question is raised because when you're playing for money, skin color is under pressure as a consideration.
So you're saying, I guess, that just because it's North or South, I mean, it didn't just because there weren't any teams in the South, in the National League, really, for the most part. I guess Richmond had a team in the AA for a while and all that. It didn't make any difference,
Well, there's no clear North or South thing where the Northern fans were tolerant of black players and the Southern fans were hostile to it. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that you have to look at, now just throw this out here, is you have to look at the way the press treats it too. I mean, which is really interesting in a lot of ways about how is the press actually looking at it. So, to go back to Frank Grant for a minute, it's that famous picture. Well, it said nobody's touching him. Okay, that's true. And he's the one that asked him to put it down. But it's really interesting, the role of the press, because, for example, when I was researching seasons of Buffalo baseball, I read virtually every article that I could find on Frank Grant during his 3 years for all the Buffalo papers. And there's not a single anything really that says, other than that breakout in Toronto. And for those that you remember from the book where he was basically there and they were shouting, "Kill the N" and all these other horrible things, there's nothing in the Buffalo papers that say, "We don't want him here." There's nothing from his teammates that say, "We don't want him here." So the papers, it's interesting because now they're a different avenue. They can be used one way or another.
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, I kind of talked about that a little bit. We were talking about Thomas Fitzgerald in Philadelphia because I was trying to get an idea of the racial climate there. And of course, Philadelphia had a lot of Quaker abolitionists in it. Some of them were involved in baseball, like Hicks Hayhurst. But Frederick Douglass said it was the up South and that it was worse than the South in terms of race relations. On the other hand, Thomas Fitzgerald, our baseball guy, one of the founders of the Athletics, is a publisher of for many years, the newspaper with the biggest circulation. And he's absolutely beating the drum for integration and freeing and abolitionism over and over again. And it's hard to imagine, there had to be a constituency for that in Philadelphia or no one would buy his paper. So the papers had points of view and they're not always majority points of view. So it's complicated.
Yeah. So Rowley, I see you.
Excuse me, Paul. I think Tom Bradley's got his hand up. He's got.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it. Please go right ahead, Tom. I'm looking at the chat too.
That wasn't me.
Well, your hand. Okay, we'll take it down, but there you go.
Sorry
So
about
there is
that.
something in the chat from is it Rowley or Rowley? Do you want to put your point out, or would you like me to read it for it, throw it out there for you?
Can put it out. I'm a historian of race and the United States, among other newly acquired interest in baseball history. But it's common for folks to conflate abolitionists with anti-racists, which is not the case at all. A lot of abolitionists were very much into white supremacy, which is why many of them wanted to export African Americans to Liberia or the Caribbean or other places. So once slavery is free, is emancipated, abolitionists oftentimes say, well, great, our job is done. We don't want to integrate our schools in the North. We don't want to integrate our neighborhoods in the North. We were just opposed to slavery as an immoral system. And so Ryan Swanson, among others, who I know very well at University of New Mexico, has written a couple books on Reconstruction and baseball. And basically, he argues that Northerners really didn't put up a fight at all in terms of keeping baseball segregated because their other institutions in the North were already segregated. And that allowed baseball to be a very minor way of national reunification in the decades after the Civil War.
Yeah, I think we need to understand the context here. Historically, integration was very much, in the modern sense, was very much the minority view in the world. Segregation, in some form or another, was the norm throughout most of the world and throughout all of history, literally until the idea in the 1850s that integration might be a good thing or a moral thing. You're talking about trying to reverse 5,000 years of history with the Civil War and a few amendments. It isn't going to happen. I know in Illinois, they passed a law. Illinois was for the abolition of slavery, but they also passed a law saying, basically, blacks aren't allowed to move into Illinois.
If I can interject something here, a lot of the Northern support for the Civil War was on the basis of being pro-union as opposed to being pro-integration. Those are two separate things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And integration is not the only consideration, right? I mean, it's interesting that all the discussions about race in amateur era baseball, no one ever talks about whether the clubs should be mixed. The question is usually, should a black club be allowed to play a white club, or should a black club be allowed in our organization? It seemed almost unthinkable to a lot of people at the time to have a club that might have some black and some white players together. That issue doesn't come up. And I think that's because basically people live so separately. And as, was it Rowley that made this point? Yeah, all what we call the Jim Crow laws were invented north of the Mason-Dixon line for the most part, because in a slave society, you don't have to legislate the separation of white and black people. You only have to do that when black people are free. But anyway, that's the subject for 100 more books.
Yeah.
To echo what Bruce, you were saying about segregation being the norm, every once in a while I read an article about how Cap Anson should be kicked out of the Hall of Fame because of his racist views. And he was a racist, but he was so disliked and so disliked by everybody back then. If people really disagree with him, they would have championed black players to be in the baseball. But the reason they didn't is because they all felt the same way. But Cap Anson was just so public about his beliefs.
But what's interesting, real quick, I'm just going to say this, Jack. What's interesting about that is if you look at the Cuban Giants, and you know Tom talks about this, you know they're like, oh wait, whoa. We have these black baseball players. Nope, they can't be black. We're going to replace them with Italians.
That's right, Italian. Yeah,
you know, and then people were like, no, we love these guys. Why? Yeah. And they're revolted. But nobody ever stepped up and said, this is wrong. Like, we're okay with them playing over here on their little field, but nobody figured out that the next step was either, like you said, either integrating or what have you. It's just weird. And I mean, if you even fast forward, you know, you had an information there about Lippman Pike. The last book we talked about had Lippman Pike and the fact that he's Jewish. And you talk about, you know, as we go forward into the, you know, the integration with Jackie, I remember watching a clip. If you guys have, and I know we're fast forwarding a moment, but if you watch the clip from 42, when I can't think of the Philadelphia manager who's absolute ragging on Jackie. He says, if we play DiMaggio, we call him a this. We call him a wop. If we play, Greenberg, we call him a kike or a Jew. I'm just calling him what he is. So it's like this concept. You made a really great point, Bruce, where it's like, we have 5,000 years. The Civil War happened, and everybody's kind of like, now what? And that includes baseball. It includes everything else. And we had a now what philosophy for what? Almost 100 more years.
Well, I mean, you can't turn 5,000 years of history on and off like you turn on a light switch on and off.
Yep.
That things don't happen that quickly. And I just like to add that Tom's book is very good on talking about the social gulfs, social integration in baseball. In fact, that's probably more prominent than the racial integration of baseball in Tom's book. And some of the same issues were involved there also.
Tom, a quick question. You mentioned that Grant was not physically touched by the people on his team. Can you give an example of that? I mean, it wasn't patted on the back or.
I think I was talking about the team photograph.
Yeah, there's a team photograph.
I see. Yeah, I saw the team photograph. Yeah,
they're all resting an arm on each other's shoulders and stuff, but they're conspicuously not touching him.
Oh, I got it right here. You're right. Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't catch that.
There's other supporting evidence that there was a bunch of players on his team that were angry that he was on the team. Maybe not all.
I see it there now. Yeah. Okay.
But the interesting thing. Sorry, go ahead. I apologize.
That's it.
I was just saying the interesting thing about Grant is if you look at him statistically, and if you look at him from the first couple of years he was there, which is, I believe, 76, 77, if my math is correct, he was phenomenal. Played second base. He played very well. He did this. And then in 78, he moved to right field. So the problem is what's interesting about it is if you look at the stats of that 78 year, he moved to right field. And a lot of people are like, well, it's because he was slid into, he was spiked, he was this, he was that, and his play declined. Well, his play declined, but if you look at the record of the Bisons in 78, they were god awful. Mm-hmm. So the point is, which is the chicken or the egg? Is Grant a product of, the 1878 Colorado Rockies, or the Colorado Rockies of 1878 a product of Grant? So sorry for Woody. I know you're in Colorado. I am too. I get it. But they're the quickest example I could think of. So, but go ahead.
Just a quick comment. You mentioned Lippman Pike. I did not know he was Jewish, but when I went through the William Hulbert papers in Chicago, I have a letter in my files in which he lambasted Lippman Pike. And now I'm wondering if the fact that he was Jewish had anything to do with it.
I think he was an unpleasant person, and I don't think.
Oh, okay.
There was a lot of reasons to dislike him that have nothing to do with his religion.
Oh, good. Because that makes me feel better then, because that's the way I look at it. Took it myself.
He was unpopular with ownership and the Major League Baseball.
Yeah, I think Hulbert called him an ungrateful whelp.
And, I mean, it's kind of interesting how many Jewish players there are on the scene in early amateur baseball in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I was looking into that when I was writing my book, and it was kind of a eye-opening thing to read about. In a society where being Catholic was extremely extreme social handicap. And the problem, it has to do with the Jewish community in New York being so old and so prosperous, so respectable.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a memoir from a sort of New York, from a guy from a wealthy New York trading family. He wrote it in the 1830s, I believe. And he said that there was no problem if someone from the upper classes had a son that married a Jewish girl. But to marry a daughter of Aaron was social death, he said.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And, I think that's a New York thing.
Yeah.
And, I've never seen any evidence that there was anti-Semitism, on the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
In the New York press, there was a lot of bragging about how well Jews were treated in New York. And and the criticism of English anti-Semitism.
So I'm going to throw out, I know we're wrapping up time here, but I'm going to throw out a question as far as just a curiosity. You started out one of your chapters with, I think it was 1869 was the death of cricket or something like that. So here's a question I would like to ask, and I don't know much about cricket whatsoever. So I can ask my Indian friend and he'll talk to me for 15 minutes and then I'll be like, when's the Bills game on? Because that's about the end of that conversation. So my question is this. So, and this has always fascinated me when as I look at these early teams, and you mentioned it here, as if to underline the unity of the three elements of the traditional urban male culture: militias, firefighting, and baseball. Time and time again, they are tied together. You started out in the book and you talked about, the engines and how they were, and you talked about the crisp performance, and you talked about the crisp performance on the field. And then you look at these, and I look at, for example, the Niagaras, which are my passion. They started out, they were played baseball together. They were Taylor Hose number one, and then they formed a Buffalo company and they went off to battle together. My question is this: was that part of the reason death of cricket? Did cricket not have that unity of these band of brothers, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I think the short answer is they didn't. And it's cricket.
What?
It's a different story. Why? It's a different story in different places. But cricket wasn't. I go at great length in the book to talk about how picking a British sport as our national sport was a problem in that time and place because of people's mindsets and our experience. I mean, this is a really interesting, complicated question, right? Because it's not as simple as being anti-British. The Indians, Jamaicans, the Australians, they're not in love with the United Kingdom historically. They all play cricket. But it is a question of national identity and culture. And if you're talking about New York, there was a problem with cricket. There were a lot of people promoting cricket and trying to sell it. Henry Chadwick in 1856 realizes that it's not going to work. He loved cricket. I mean, he for a while he's trying to say that we could have two national sports, cricket and baseball, and they would benefit from interacting with each other. And then there's all the baseball players that played cricket. But the cricket establishment in New York was very it was insular, it was snobbish. The St. George Club excluded Americans, 99%. They actually were okay with Creighton because he was a great bowler, but they had a general attitude of not being interested in building the sport in America. So I think in Philadelphia is a different story, a little, quite different. But I think what it really comes down to is people couldn't stomach a foreign sport, the sport that was already the national sport of the United Kingdom, being our national sport. It just wasn't going to work. But I also think cricket, baseball was on a mission to sell itself to America. Cricket wasn't.
Yeah, and looking at the newspaper reports from the time, they make all the practical objections that we all know about. The game is too long for Americans. It takes too many players. It takes up too much room, especially in a city. Baseball is a 90-degree game. Cricket is a 360-degree game. So it's a lot easier to find a field for baseball than it is for cricket. But beyond that, there's a certain jingoism. But again, you're talking about the social attitudes here. It was an immigrant game, and the immigrants formed their own societies, just like the hose companies did, just like the militia groups did. It was their game, but it wasn't necessarily everybody's game.
Yeah, I think the question is sort of backwards, right? It's more interesting to say, why did baseball become the national sport than why another sport didn't? Because there were other candidates.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little tidbit because I have a book coming out in March about Creighton. And this forced me to learn a lot more than I wanted to learn about cricket. I had to be able to understand the box scores and figure out what Creighton was doing when he was bowling in cricket matches. And at a certain point, I realized that I was wondering why he was playing cricket at the same time playing baseball and clearly wearing himself down physically. So what was in it for him? And it jumps out at you when you get to a certain level of understanding of cricket. Cricket limited the number of pitches, the number of balls that each in an at bat. I'm using a baseball terminology. They limited it, and baseball didn't, which was a huge problem for Creighton. Contributing to his death. You could sit in 1859. You could watch 80 pitches go by without swinging a bat, with no penalty. In cricket, I think it was 6 overs or 6 balls in an over. So if anyone understands cricket, they can probably correct me. But when I actually calculated his workload, he was throwing maybe 45 pitches an inning, 30 to 45 pitches an inning in baseball. And in cricket, for an entire match, he was throwing between 85 and 120. And for a guy who's having trouble carrying the workload that he was carrying, I think cricket was a bit of a day off for him.
I would like to add something to my impressions of Tom's book and what, in a way, makes his writing so special in a way, his research of his writing, is that it gives us an opportunity to see things that are often missed. We all discussed here already about how Americans, well, probably most people, come to take on certain stories as being, well, this is how it must have, this is how it happened. And without really knowing fully what happened. So I want to give you 2 shining examples from Tom's book that I got from it. One was the story of the Cincinnati Red Stockings and their sudden, apparently, decline after losing that game to the Atlantics in June of 1870. And, it was probably maybe the most famous game of the 19th century, is that supposed upset. And we all accept this idea. And in fact, somebody just recently wrote a very good book involving the Red Stockings. And that person, that author, kind of summed it up in the way that most baseball fans understand what the demise of the Cincinnati Red Stockings was all about. That, they lost the game. Their edge came off. Nobody was really interested anymore. They didn't have the fan support that they would normally have had, and so forth and so on. But when I was a young kid in my neighborhood, all of us young kids knew what policy was. And it wasn't such a good thing. It involved gambling. And Tom introduces us to someone who's in a executive position with the Cincinnati team, John Joyce, who nobody's really paid attention to at all, and begins to kind of weave a story about what are the machinations of John Joyce, what are the political ambitions of the president of the team champion. What was it, Aaron Champion, Tom? I forget his first name. But you begin to realize that there's much more behind this story of the demise of the Red Stockings than just simply losing a game to the Atlantics and so forth. That's one example. A second example is, why is Tom Fitzgerald so progressive in a sense in trying to foster interracial play in Philadelphia, which at a point in his life, he's already now a wealthy man, and he has, he's a wealthy newspaper man. And Tom begins to introduce an idea that perhaps Tom Fitzgerald's boyhood involved a great deal of being an indentured servant, and that he may have had a certain empathy for African Americans and their predicament in our society at the time, particularly, and to some degree still in effect. So that's what I really think. I had the honor this year, or the opportunity uniquely. My brother and I went down to a premiere of the new film by Ken Burns on the American Revolution. And it was just about 45 minutes of a film that was shown. And the commentary of one of Ken Burns' co-producers was there and talked about the filming. And my brother and I walked out of the film. We live 20 minutes from the Washington's Crossing. Bob certainly knows where it is. And I said to David, did you ever know before that the crossing that everybody, considers this great success was one of only 3 crossings? It was one of 3 crossings that were intended. The other 2 crossings failed. And I just took this story of Washington crossing the Delaware as, the official version of American history. And that was simply that. Never talked about the other 2 crossings that didn't work, and how Washington had to go into Trenton. Although he did have the largest faction that made the crossings, he was only one of 3 intended crossings. The other 2 failed. So we kind of take these stories and we just kind of grasp them and call them the official history of what happened naturally. Right? Anyway, so Tom, that's what I got from that reading, and Paul, what I got from that reading, as two examples of what I think Tom did so effectively.
So we're at the top of the hour. I'm gonna throw a couple things out unless anybody else has any final thoughts or comments they want to make. So if not, is it Rowley or Rowley? I'm sorry.
Rowley.
Rowley, fair enough. Rowley, I call on people in my moderations, so you got called on. I would encourage you. I would encourage you. You mentioned you have a friend who did some books on baseball and Reconstruction. I would encourage you to, if you'd like, let us know about these and be happy to moderate. We're a really good group, and this is a heck of a lot of fun. It's just really good. These guys are great. I don't know if you've been to one of our conferences yet or not.
I'm a brand new member.
All right, fair enough. Well, I would personally like to offer you to come to our conference in Cooperstown and meet everybody in person. Amazing bunch of guys. And then I'm going to finalize something with a quick story from my own personal life about Mr. Gilbert here. So when this book came out, I think in 2019, 2020, I remember coming out and I was ecstatic. And I went to Barnes & Noble. I didn't have enough. I was pretty broke at that time. I went to Barnes & Noble and read snippets of it until I could actually afford to buy it. And from this point on to actually meeting you, Tom, to have an autographed copy, to helping you out with some genealogical research because of near where I live, it's pretty phenomenal journey for me in 7 years to actually moderate this book. So I just want to thank you. This is an amazing work. It's something I've read twice and I'm going to reread because I keep diving deeper in every time I do it. It's kind of like, as we historians like to say, peeling back the layers of an onion. So, and I mean that in the most metaphorical, positive way I can say it. So anyway, thanks to Tom. I appreciate you being here tonight, everyone else. And I'm going to go ahead, unless anyone has any questions, hand it back over to Bob. So thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, the audience. It was a very, very lively conversation here, covering a lot of different topics as we were going through. And we'll all go home and take something different away from this session, but it's interesting, from professionalism and amateurism to racial inequalities and reactions to black player, to where did baseball evolve? From where did baseball evolve? I thought Woody's point of the teammates and local teams was an important step in that evolution that we came through. Peter, do you have any closing announcements that you would like to make?
Yes, for just a couple of things is that our winter newsletter will be out just January 2nd. I think we gave as a publication date. It will contain the complete information on our Frederick Iver Campbell 19th Century Baseball Conference, which kicks off, the registration kicks off that day when that January 2nd, when that appears. I will say you'll see the complete program. And you'll see something a little bit different this year. What we were able to do, we were able to capture the original abstracts submitted of the 15 presentations that are going on there, 12 that are double track into 6 time slots, and the 3 that will be in the bullpen theater, and in the grandstand theater, which were the 3 top scoring presentation. And I do want to say that Tom almost pulled off a trifecta, but he was first among 15. So Tom, congratulations. I'd like to just say that to you again. It's
Well, it's going to be a fun topic, let me tell you.
Yeah, it was a great topic. There was no doubt about it. And we and Bruce will be our keynote speaker there, and we're looking forward to it ourselves. And it's a wonderful program. Has very interesting presentations, as always. One dinner instead of 2, and a different location, a whole new spot, and all of that will be available as of the winter newsletter coming out on January 2nd. I want to thank Paul again for doing such a great job and stimulating a really nice discussion about this work. And again, as I said about David Block's book, damn, it's a lot to bring in, and Tom's also, but you did a great job with it, Paul. And our next book discussion actually will be in February, and it'll be Matt Albertson presentation on Jerry Casway's wonderful biography of Ed Delahanty, the great star of the 19th century. And I remember conferring with Jerry way back when I was just a rookie SABR member, writing about Brewery Jack Taylor, who was a native to my Staten Island when I lived in Staten Island. And he was a star pitcher of the Phillies in that decade. And anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and we'll see Matt at our next book discussion, and we'll see Jack Bales, I think, in January. I think the 13th, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah, it's 13th, right.
And he'll be our next 19th century speaker series, which Bob Bailey initiated, and we're well into season 6.
The next speaker series is next Tuesday.
Oh, that's right. Yes, our next. I'm sorry.
And it's going to focus on the Cleveland Spiders of 1899, and match it up with the. I think he replayed the entire. The speaker will speak ran the whole season through Stratomatic baseball, and we will see what kind of fun Christmassy stuff we can get out of this as we do something a little different here with the history of the Spiders in 1899 and how Stratomatic may have evaluated that season. But thank you all for being here, and we will see you all either next Tuesday or perhaps in January for Jack's
Yep,
talk.
certainly. Yep. Okay, on our way. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you again, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, very much.
Good night, all.
Good night.
All right, good night.